everybody, Danica here. This is going to be my first voiceover I've ever done, so bear with me, it might be a little rough, but a lot of you have been asking for a voiceover, so here it is. Here's my voice, hope you like it. I'll probably be switching between doing videos with voiceovers and my regular time-lapse videos with music, just because I know a lot of you still like to just chill out and listen to music while some art comes together. But please let me know if you like this type of video and if you have anything you'd like me to talk about. That way I won't ramble on forever about things that you don't care about. Now, just as a disclaimer, I'm not an expert at oil painting and I don't want anyone to think that I am. I'm definitely still learning. But I do like to share what tips and tricks I've learned in the few years that I have been oil painting. So if you have any questions, let me know and I'll do my best to answer them. Today I'm going to be trying to paint a portrait without any references whatsoever. And it's been a while since I've tried to do this, but I think the last time I did, it was with pastel pencil, which used to be my medium of choice. But whenever I try to paint or draw someone without a reference, they always end up looking like the same person, just because I think I have a basic idea of how certain features work in my head. But we'll see if it ends up looking the same. So far, it's kind of looking like it's going that way. I started this piece with a mix of Gamsol and oil paint, which I used as a wash to create that gradient effect in the background. I was planning on scraping away some of the later layers like I've done in some of my other paintings so that background would show through, but that didn't end up happening. My first goal is to start out with the basic shapes and tones of the face and then later go in with the details. This way I make sure everything has the right proportions and is where I want it. But honestly, I think I was rushing through the beginning process just because I wanted to see what the result would be, and because of this I chose a weird angle and had to tilt my head the entire time, and now I apologize if you have to do the same. I also think the proportions ended up being a little bit off because I didn't take enough time to make sure everything was correctly lined up. And that, my friends, is the importance of laying in a strong foundation. For this painting, I really wanted to keep my palette somewhat limited because I didn't want to get distracted by different colors. So I'm really just trying to see what I can do in terms of creating a somewhat realistic portrait. So I'm using a lot of warm tones and trying to stay away from using any black as it cools and desaturates colors. White is also a cool color, so I'm trying not to use a lot of that either, and when I do, I try to add a little bit of yellow. When I'm using a reference, for the most part, I usually use either photos I've made myself or photos that I've gotten permission from photographers to use, or I take multiple photos and create my own reference. And sometimes I just use a photo as a basic guide for how the proportions work and how light hits at certain angles, so it turns out being more like the skeleton of the piece more than anything. I think it's really hard not to use a reference, especially when you want it to be realistic. It takes a ton of practice and studying to be able to remember how the subtleties in color and value work, and what details show up where, and if something is slightly off, it can ruin the whole effect. So if you feel bad about using references, please don't. Everyone uses them to some degree. So I've gotten to the point in this painting where I have most of the midtones down, and now I'm going in and adding more shadows to add more depth, and then I'll add in some highlights pretty soon. At this point, the hair I'm not a huge fan of. It's kind of giving me noodle vibes more than hair vibes at this point, so you'll see me mess with it a lot. Here I'm going in with some dark red and brown for the shadows, trying to add more contrast and depth to it, but I added it to the wrong place and made her look kind of dead. So, yeah, I'm gonna fix that, hopefully. So you may have noticed a change in this painting. I gave up on this painting for the night and slept on it, which I do pretty often with paintings. It's just good to take a step back from them pretty often. That way you don't become too focused on one section of the painting and start over-rendering without looking at the bigger picture. Sometimes just taking a picture of it and looking at it on your phone will force you to look at it from a distance and see what needs to be improved. And I do that a lot too, but I think I didn't step away from this one very much at first, so when I came back to it the next day, I realized a lot was off. I realized the shadows underneath the brows wouldn't have been quite so large at that angle, considering the shadow under the nose, and I added some eyelash cast shadows and brought more light to the eyes and into the irises to make it seem as though there was light shining into them. At this point, I was just going over everything over and over again and changing highlights and shadows until it looked somewhat right. That's kind of the blessing and curse of oil paint. You can just keep painting until your heart's desire. But that can turn into never being finished or getting too into the details, which I tend to do. Again, I think in this particular piece I was too focused on the details and as a result forgot about the bigger picture. Should have just stood back and focused on the basic proportions and shading that wasn't working. I get asked a lot for pointers and tips for beginners, and while I'm not comfortable with trying to teach anyone exactly how to paint and what processes to use because I'm not sure what the best practices are for me yet, I always tell them at least one thing, and that is to paint what you see and not what you think you see. Instead of looking at a face and being stressed about painting the eyes or the nose or the mouth, think of it all as just a bunch of shapes that flow into each other, not as objects. You can measure each shape against one another, look at the angles, and compare them to other parts of the subject. And don't worry about color so much as tone, which is how light or dark something is. A lot of it is really just comparing shapes and tones to other sections inside the piece. From that point, just be sure to be present when you're making art so that you're actually learning while you're creating and not just replicating what you see. That's helped me a lot over the years and has allowed me to get more creative and change things like the hair, lighting, or features in different portraits because I can remember how certain things work. I still have a long way to go though. I got really frustrated with the hair and decided to make it more of a strawberry blonde and create more flyaways to make it look frizzier and less stringy. And I'm using this sad liner brush that I ruined a little bit ago after I forgot to clean it. Its bristles are all splayed out, so it actually makes for a great brush to create frizzy hair. So don't worry if you're ruining your brushes like I do. They just turn into different brushes altogether. At this point, I was just not having fun with this painting anymore, so I decided to stop and call it done for now. Looking at it, there's a lot I would change about how I went about making the painting and how it's executed in general. I think it's kind of flat and it just doesn't work for me. But in the end, this has just been a good reminder to be more present and practice active learning in all of my paintings. Maybe I'll come back to it later, but for now, let's try something different. So I'm making a new piece, and this time planning out the features a bit more and going for a more simple angle. I decided to try to take a more impressionist approach for this one, just being more intentional with each brushstroke and doing my best not to get sucked into the details. Forcing myself to use this flat brush for most of the painting really helped me do this. When I needed to get more detailed, I'd use the edge of the brush, which gave the details a looser feel. And I really love this flat brush that I'm using here. It's very flexible and great for laying in paint, particularly if you're using a panel or a hard surface. A soft brush like this will let you lay in paint without scraping away any of the underneath layers, which can happen a lot when you're painting on hard surfaces. It also just feels super satisfying. I'm using a mix of Gamsol and stand oil for most of this painting, like the first painting I did, but stand oil has a honey-like consistency, and when you mix it with a bit of Gamsol, the paint feels really smooth and buttery, and it just feels super nice. Like the first painting, I started with the basic shapes and tones of the face using the same palette, but this time I didn't go into the details quite so quickly. I really wanted to just play with the paint and let it speak for itself this time. I did want to add a little bit of detail to sections like the eyes, just because that's where people tend to look, so I did use a spotter here and there to add darker shadows and small highlights. The great thing about Impressionism and leaving larger, soft brushstrokes is that the human mind can fill in a lot of blanks. I'm slowly learning what I can and can't leave to the imagination, though. Like, the eyes, I think, need to be somewhat detailed to have a soul, but I think a lot of things like the mouth and the edges of the face can be blurred out a bit. But being less perfectionist about things and experimenting can give way to some cool textures and patterns that you wouldn't otherwise get if you were doing realism. I'm adding the hair now, but I'm not going to make it nearly as detailed as last time. Instead, I'm using large brushstrokes with different mixes of stand oil and Gamsol in the paint to create different textures and add some interest. I'm layering in more light brushstrokes near the top of the painting and darker near the bottom around the neck, since the light is coming from the top and I still want to give the illusion of hair. But I'm also kind of trying to meld it into the background because I don't want things to look too real. Just watching this is making me want to paint again. It was just so fun to be able to play around with paint like this. To be honest, I really needed this reminder that I don't actually need a reference to make art. I was finding myself getting stuck because I was having trouble finding and making references that inspired me, and just focusing on realism was getting kind of boring. The first painting took me, I think, 5 or 6 hours altogether, and this one only took me an hour, and it was so much more fun. And although practicing realism without references let me realize that I have a lot to improve on, this made me realize that I need to be actually having fun with my paintings and not focus on imperfection. In fact, imperfection is kind of what makes it fun.